so much for coming out today for our Book Sandwiched In program. My name is Dina Viviani, and I'm the programming librarian here. Just to start with a few announcements. For safety purposes, if there's a need to evacuate the building, the door on your left, my right, is the closest exit. For anyone using a hearing aid, we invite you to take advantage of our induction loop system. It amplifies all sound coming through the microphone. Please silence or turn off your cell phones now so as not to disrupt the speaker. And we ask that when we have time for Q&A at the end, you wait for this microphone so that everyone can hear and participate. And as always, I want to thank the Friends of Bright Memorial Library for sponsoring this program and so many programs that we do. We have March program brochures on the table by the exit, where we also have some of our upcoming books. There's a lot going on in March, so we've got Return of Sunday Serenades on March 13th. We've got Color Bright and Green. We've got two programs with planting and color, or a program on planting with Color Bright and Green and on electric heating and cooling. And then our own librarian, Matt Bayshore, will be doing a program on the Home Acres murder of 1922. Oh, there he is now. So please stop by for those programs and make sure you grab one of our brochures. And with that, I'm going to hand the mic to Anne to introduce our speaker.
Hi there, I'm Anne Bonachek. Thank you for coming today. So I'm introducing Nevin Fischer. He's the Executive Director of the Center for International Education and an Associate Professor of Chinese and East Asian History. His bachelor degree is from Wake Forest, and his master's and PhD degrees in modern Chinese history are from the University of Virginia. Fischer oversees Nazareth's international partnerships and study abroad programs, as well as the yearly arrival of international students and scholars from around the globe. He enjoys leading student groups to China and has studied and lived there, including Taiwan, for nearly 5 years. Fluent in Mandarin, Fischer also serves as an elected member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations.
So thank you, everyone. It's my pleasure to come to you today and talk about the story, really, of Vietnam in the 20th century. I have to say that I've been really distracted the last week by Ukraine. And last night I participated in a forum at Nazareth College that was really devoted to the Russian war on Ukraine. And it's kind of been echoing in my mind as I've been preparing for this lecture, because this whole book is about war in Vietnam and suffering of people, senseless suffering that takes place through war, but also it's a story of human resilience. And so as you kind of hear me talk about this book and try to center this book within the overarching story of Vietnamese history in the 20th and 21st centuries, you can also think about Ukraine and its struggle against a very powerful, a very aggressive neighbor. Kind of a struggle that it too has been going through, actually, if you look back through time, for many centuries. So The Mountains Sing, it's fiction, except it reads really almost like nonfiction, if you're aware at all of Vietnamese history, even bits and pieces of Vietnamese history from what you know through our American involvement in their civil war in the 20th century. It was written by Nguyen van Chi Minh. Chi Minh would be her personal name. She was born in 1973, so she's just a little bit younger than me. I was in Vietnam 1 month after the United States normalized relations with Vietnam. So I was there in the mid-1990s. And I spent most of my time actually in Ho Chi Minh in the Mekong Delta. And then I went to neighboring Cambodia. I was a language student in neighboring Taiwan and decided to take my Chinese New Year holiday into a warmer place. I was very conscious when I went. I was going as an American who knew Chinese. I was traveling with one of my classmates who was born in Cambodia, but who was born of Vietnamese refugee parents who gave him up for adoption And then he was adopted by French colonials who were in Cambodia. So it was pulling all these narratives and all these stories together in a very personal way. I did not, at the time, however, get to go to Hanoi. In the years since, I've taught many students from Vietnam. I've also taught courses on the war in Vietnam, the American war in Vietnam. And as a part of those courses, I built the classes around oral history. And one year, our students interviewed many of Rochester's Vietnamese refugee community that came in the 1970s and then in the 1980s, both from North and from South Vietnam. And then the next time I taught the course, students interviewed Vietnam veterans. And the goal was to kind of bend those stories together. The third time I taught the course, but then I became an administrator. She is a poet. She's published many books. Chi Mai comes from a very interesting background because she was actually born in the North, but raised in the South, born into poverty. When she moved to the South, she faced discrimination on the streets of Vietnam. She worked on the streets selling bits and pieces, operating a small stall. She was very bright, ended up getting a scholarship, was able to study abroad. She speaks many different languages, but she wrote this book in English, which is not her mother tongue. And she would tell you that by writing a book that's not in Vietnamese, it allowed her maybe some freedoms that would not have been possible had she written the book in Vietnamese. And it's interesting to note that this has not yet been translated into Vietnamese, although it's an international bestseller. And I think that's telling because what she has to say in the book is very damning of the Vietnamese government that ultimately did come to power and unite the country in a very painful way. So it's called The Mountains Sing. On one level, it refers to a bird, the wooden carving of a bird. That's actually a skylark that's native to the mountains of Vietnam. But on probably a more powerful level, The Mountains Sing. The mountains is about the Vietnamese people. And the song is their stories. And it's a multiplicity of stories. It's not just one uniting story. She focuses on a grandmother and granddaughter. So I'll refer to them throughout today as Diolan and as Huang, or just Diolan and her granddaughter. But it's also a story of women. It's a story of family, suffering and sacrifice, lost love, and of resilience. All things that I think are happening right now too in Ukraine, especially as we watch families being separated on trains and on buses as the men stay behind and as the women go to leave the country. So Vietnam is shaped like an S. And what I want to do today is, because I'm an historian, I'm going to try to do a very difficult task of centering a non-chronological story. If you've started the book or finished the book yet, you know that it jumps back and forth in time. And sometimes that can make it confusing until you see the whole, and then you realize what's happening. But I'm trying to center a non-chronological fictional story into the chronological story of Vietnam, particularly in the 20th century. And I want to do that a little bit by looking at the place, the people, and then the time. And then we're increasingly going to get into the book the further along that I do this. So Vietnam is shaped like the letter S. I'll come back to that in a bit. The population is quite large, considering the size of Vietnam. It's about 103 million people. It was an incredibly young population in the aftermath of the war and with reunification. As you can imagine, the United States post-World War II, big baby boom. Despite crushing poverty in Vietnam, there was a huge baby boom post-war. And things had begun to kind of level off a little bit as the cost of living and the standard of living has increased and improved within Vietnam. But 103 million people, you'll see just how big of a population that is in a moment. There are 54 ethnic groups in Vietnam, so it's much more diverse than you could imagine. But the largest, the majority ethnic group, the Viet peoples or the Ken peoples, they make up just under 90%. The other minority groups would also include ethnic Chinese who have lived within Vietnam for centuries. It would also include the Hmong peoples. The United States is a very large Hmong population that live particularly in the upper Midwest. And what you're seeing here that I'm featuring are some of the hill tribes that exist. The architecture of Vietnam is a mix of indigenous architecture with Chinese influences, local Vietnamese touches. You see lots of legacy architecture of the French occupation, including the presidential palace built by the French when they occupied Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and a region that they called Indochine. The star of Vietnam is on a red field with a yellow star. The red field, this is a communist country, so this stands for blood and sacrifice. It was also inspired by the Chinese flag, which has the similar kind of red background and red field. But the single star with 5 points represents the 5 different classifications of people that the communists identified would lead society. And these include workers, intellectuals, peasants, laborers, and traders, interestingly. The grandmother becomes a trader in the story, which for much of the time she was a trader was a bad term. The national dish is probably pho, and if you've not had it, there's several Vietnamese restaurants in town. Please go have it. It's an incredible dish. Now, geography. Let's come back to this letter S-shaped country. It's quite long, but very thin, and I've superimposed it over a map of the United States, just so you can see how long it actually is. It's not aligning with the latitudes. It's much further south, much warmer overall. But you can see that the entire country is just a little bit larger than one state, our state of New Mexico. New Mexico's a big state. Most of our western states are big, but we are a huge country. So just keep in mind this letter S, that overall it's not that large, but 103 million people. The north is quite mountainous, particularly as it borders China and Yunnan province within China. And those are a beautiful mountain range. It's heavily rice terraced in that area. But the north then also flattens out towards the coast. And that's where the Red River Valley is. And this is where Hanoi is, in kind of a flat basin as it approaches the sea. This is that Red River Basin, in fact, around Hanoi. This is also not far away from Hanoi. This is Halong Bay, quite dramatic, very different kind of landscape from that Red River Basin area, but you can sort of see how the continents pulled apart and created these chains of islands. In the central part of the country, so where the S becomes its thinnest and begins to pull apart, this thinnest strip is really less than 50 kilometers wide. So it's very, very narrow here. And it's a mix of geography. It's a mix of marshland, of dramatic beaches. There are some mountains that abut right up against Laos. But this is also the historic capital of Vietnam from 1,000 years ago until the French occupation. So Vietnamese emperors had their palace here. There's some remnants of those palaces that remain. You can see Chinese influence in the architecture here in that central spine. And then the south. The south is where Ho Chi Minh is located, Ho Chi Minh City. And this is the Mekong Delta. This is one of the world's great rivers, and it kind of fans out across rice fields and banana plantations until it meets the ocean. The majority of the population is based down here in the Mekong Delta. I want to focus on two cities because these two cities are really at the center of the story. Hanoi is the current political capital. It was also the French capital during the colonial period. And it's socially more conservative, politically more conservative than the south of the country. These are some images of Hanoi today. You can see it's a modern city on top of an old city. And slowly they're destroying some of these enclosed, tight neighborhoods and building some of the high-rises. But the interest and the life and the noise and the smells, they're all contained in those tight old neighborhoods. This is one of the old streets. And in the book, you'll read about Silver Street or Salt Street. And it looks just like this. The book also references ponds within the city of Hanoi, and picking flowers, lotus flowers in the ponds where lovers would gather to meet. This is one of those famous ponds within Hanoi. Down in the south, it's kind of a different feel. Saigon, as Americans will still often refer to Ho Chi Minh City. This was the capital of the southern government in Vietnam for many decades within the 20th century, and it's always been progressive and relaxed, and it still is progressive and relaxed, very much the capital heart of Vietnam. And that's played out in the architecture. It did not look anything like this when I visited 25 years ago. But you can see that the old and the new do coexist here. This is one of the Roman Catholic cathedrals in the heart of old Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, built by the French. And this was one of the important colonial buildings of the French that then was later used by the South Vietnamese government. So, super quick overview of Vietnamese history before we center right where the grandmother and the granddaughter come in. The grandmother's born in 1920. The granddaughter's born in 1960. So they're kind of nice bookends for the meaty part and the violent part of the 20th century. Much of Vietnamese history has been influenced by the mighty dragon to the north, and that remains true to this day. The influence of China can never be discounted. They share a border, but just by proximity to such a powerful empire or state has always influenced the course of Vietnamese history. And for almost 1,000 years, China occupied much of Vietnam. Not all of it, but a good portion of it. There you can see in red the Tang Dynasty, when China was its most cosmopolitan and the famed Silk Road was built that linked China all the way to Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. It also reached down about halfway into modern-day Vietnam. So it was reaching down in the area around modern-day Hanoi, the Red River Valley. Eventually, the Chinese were repelled, and Vietnam created an independent kingdom. But none of the kingdoms were very powerful or long-lived. So I have just a list of kingdoms, and you can see on average they're 200 or 300 years in length. The very last kingdom, the Nguyen Dynasty, 1802 to 1945, is really where we're going to begin the story of the Nguyen family. The Tran family, sorry. The French come into play in the mid-19th century. Now think about the whole world. in the 19th century. This is the century of colonialism, imperialism, where European powers, and then eventually the United States, and then eventually Japan will join in this quest for colonies. They will begin carving up the world and competing with one another to get claim over resources and people and land. And Vietnam and neighboring countries will get under French control. It didn't happen all at once. You can see it's a bit by bit conquering of parts of Vietnam, parts of Laos, parts of Cambodia. But they held on to it for more than a century. And it was very uneasy rule. What was there? Well, the biggest cash cow for the French came from the massive rubber plantations. And rubber is produced as the sap, the latex from trees. You can see it dripping sort of as we collect maple syrup around this time of year, dripping into buckets. But that latex ultimately formed the world's tires. This is, again, the legacy of French colonialism, then and now. During the French colonial era, particularly in the 1930s, more and more Vietnamese who were well educated, many who were actually educated in France, including Ho Chi Minh, began to be influenced by another global phenomenon that was rising, which was known as communism. There was communism in the Soviet Union, and there was a relatively newly formed Communist Party in China that was not yet in power. And in Europe, particularly in Paris, there was a Communist Party, and then the World Internationale. And Ho Chi Minh was exposed to communist ideology as a young student when he was sent to study French in Paris. He was very bright. He was also influenced, though, not just by theoretical underpinnings of communism, but by a real application of it in the Soviet Union with Marxism-Leninism. And of course, he's a nationalist. He wants to see the French gone, first and foremost. He was also influenced by the writings of Mao Zedong. At this point, Mao was becoming the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, but he was not yet the national head of state. China was in the middle of a civil war. The political arm of the Vietnamese Communist Party that Ho Chi Minh was a member of, he was a founding member of it, but the political arm becomes the Viet Minh, and they were really advocating for the independence of Vietnam. It's important to remember that not all members were communists, but they were all nationalists. And this is what they looked like kind of in the field as they were trying to figure out how to equip Viet Minh to resist the French. And this is important to kind of remember because this idea of struggle and suffering, of using back trails, it will be important when they resist the Japanese, and then when they resist the South Vietnamese, and when they resist the Americans. Japan comes into play in the 1930s. Now, when I mentioned that the 19th century was really the century of the rise of global European-style imperialism and colonialism, the Japanese were heavily influenced by that in the late 19th century. And they kind of remade themselves very rapidly in European image. And they were very influenced by the Americans, the British, and the Germans. And a part of becoming a colonial power means you stretch your reach beyond the island chain into neighboring Korea, into neighboring China. And then eventually, they wanted to create what's called the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, which included Southeast Asia and the Philippines. And this is where their expanse really becomes global, and it leads to a world war. I'm connected to that world war very intimately because my father grew up in Pearl Harbor, and he was 10 years old living on Hickam Air Force Base when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. So growing up, sort of my orientation about the war was always more in the Eastern theater than it was in the European theater. The Japanese occupation of Korea, of China, of Vietnam, which at the time was really not Vietnam, it was French Indochina. It was brutal. The Japanese were about extracting those resources and using human capital as slave labor. They also wanted the food stocks of the people who lived there to support their own armies. Much of the struggle in the novel, in the early years, centers around Nevan province. You can see it's in the northern half of the country, the top part of the S. It's very mountainous, but it does touch. And the struggle really very powerfully opens with one of the first great losses that occurs to the Japanese. This first loss is our main protagonist, the grandmother, Diolan. It's her father. Her father was a fairly rich farmer, again, fictional, but a fairly rich farmer in this northern province. He's not described as exploitative, but he probably had the greatest wealth within the village, the nicest house, and it had been that way for a couple generations, but the implication is that he was a very hard worker. During the war against the Japanese, this occupation, and it's an occupation on top of an occupation. Remember that the French are occupying Vietnam, and then the Japanese come in. The Japanese collaborate with the Vichy government, which is in power in France, and then there by extension in power in Vietnam. They collaborate together, theoretically sort of on the same side, but the sufferers of this collaboration are not the French, they're really the Vietnamese people. And her father is decapitated when he takes a harvest to try to sell to the city of Hanoi. The soldiers were brutal, and there were mass killings during this period. And this period is complicated because the war lasts for years within Vietnam, but it also suddenly comes to a close within 1945. And in 1945, a lot of things happen very quickly. You know that the second great loss in the story is the starvation of the village and the starvation of millions of people across Vietnam. How does this happen? What's going on? It was called the Great Famine, and you can see that the number of deaths that occurred are staggering. We are sort of witness in the story to the deaths that occur by starvation in one village in one province. But between 400,000 to 2 million people starved to death. That's a pretty big disparity, but this is also pre-accurate record keeping, and you can imagine how many records are destroyed by decades of war as well. So what's happening here in 1945? So before we get to the atomic bomb, where the Japanese very quickly lay down their arms no matter where they are in the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, be it Korea, be it in China, be it the Philippines, or be it in Vietnam. In the final months of the war, they were sort of desperate to collect as much food as they could to support their soldiers that were in the battlefield. And the French, who were no longer really collaborating with the Japanese by 1945. There was kind of increased tension, and the Vietnamese saw the French increasingly as new enemies to be worried about. We had a combination then of Japanese conscription of goods with French colonial administrative incompetence, and then terrible weather that basically either destroyed the crop or led to the complete procurement of the crops. And this is what caused this great famine and led to the second great loss within the novel. When the atomic bomb dropped and the Japanese laid down their weaponry, there was an immediate rush for power. The French wanted to come back, but this early nationalist, so heavily influenced by the communists, he had never gone away. And what had been happening during the years of the French and the Japanese occupation is his forces were growing. This very pro-nationalist Vietnam for Vietnamese, but inspired by Marxism, Leninism, and increasingly by Mao Zedong thought. He had a structure, and in this grab for land that followed the atomic bombing, and then this power vacuum of Japanese authority suddenly leaving, Ho Chi Minh effectively took control of the north of the country. The great European powers and American powers met to decide the fate of Vietnam. Vietnam was to sort of be returned by agreement to the French. That's what everyone thought would happen, but it was going to have to be gradual, and there would be free and open elections. Vietnam was going to be just temporarily partitioned until those free elections could take place. But the French weren't really interested in free elections. They wanted to return to a colony. And they struggled for about another decade to hold on to that colony. And increasingly, the French were aided by the Americans from 1945 to 1955, until the Americans outright replaced the French in trying to hold on to that colony. The turning point in the French occupation of Vietnam came in 1955 with the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and it was a resounding loss for the French. The 1954 Geneva Peace Accords were aimed at resolving the question of Vietnam, of Indochine. What happens to it? Who rules over it? And again, these accords were to kind of return to this idea of a temporary division and free elections. And it was right along the 17th parallel, this very famous parallel that gets kind of embedded in the American psyche throughout the Vietnam War. They create a demilitarized zone in that parallel. There's one other famous demilitarized zone in the world. It's between North and South Korea. But here, this DMZ, the 17th parallel between the northern half of the country and the southern half of the country, from 1955 onward, effectively split Vietnam into a communist-ruled, Ho Chi Minh-led north, and then a southern Vietnamese government led by Dinh, Ngo Dinh Dinh, supported by the Americans. They even kind of dressed like the Americans in the southern government and in the southern government military. So this is 1955. The country is kind of newly divided. We now have the northern half ruled by Ho Chi Minh and his state, and they're suddenly very confident because now they have sort of outright rule of the north. And that confidence breeds arrogance, and the arrogance breeds a disastrous policy. This shouldn't really come as any surprise, because what they do in Vietnam, they had already done in neighboring China. They did land reform in China in the 1940s and in the early 1950s, and millions of people died when they did that land reform, and it was very brutal. And Ho Chi Minh was very inspired by the land reform that Mao Zedong did. And he duplicated that same land reform in Vietnam, and this led to the third great loss in the novel. This is when we have that powerful account of the family having just brought their crops in, they're having a kind of big celebratory dinner, and then suddenly all hell breaks loose in the village as the have-nots come to seize the haves' property. And this is when her brother is killed and her son escapes. She won't see him again for decades. And then she flees with her 5 young children into the night. This land reform was brutal. These are actually images of land reform occurring in 1955. In 1957, there was a recognition that land reform got out of hand, but there wasn't really an apology. There was just a backing away from it. And really to this day, there's not been a full reconciliation of the brutality of what land reform did and how it senselessly destroyed people's livelihoods for real no purpose whatsoever. If anyone had means to them, anyone had financial comfort, if anyone was slightly better off than their neighbors almost had free permission to destroy their neighbor's property, to seize it for themselves, and to accuse them of being capitalists. And of course, it's bloody and it leads to death. After 1955, with land reform, basically the Americans begin to get involved in dribs and drabbles. It happens with Eisenhower. He's the one who really first starts to commit American advisors to Vietnam, but it increases under Kennedy. And I just want to start this section of the presentation, which is going to begin the next series of losses, by reminding you of the human capital of this next section. Look at the casualties of war. We tend to focus on that bottom number, which is a not insignificant number, 58,000. And there's a very moving Vietnam memorial in Washington, D.C., and we have one here in Rochester. Much of America has this. But if you look at the toll on the Vietnamese people themselves, 2 million civilians, more than 1 million North Vietnamese soldiers between the North and then those who infiltrated into the South, and then somewhere between, around 250,000 South Vietnamese. So it's a human toll that's kind of staggering in proportion to think about. The beautiful part about this book is that for us as Americans reading it, the book focuses on the Vietnamese people's struggle throughout this entire war. And as Americans, when we think of Vietnam and when we think of the books and of the films that have come out over the last 50 years, it's really the Americans that are at the center of those stories. It's not the Vietnamese people. They're kind of in the background of those stories. And here the author turns it on its head, and she really forces us to look at this from the Vietnamese point of view. And I think that is the real value for us to read this work and to have it through a fictional account, personalized by how one family has really struggled with that. So Kennedy firmly pulls us into the war, but the war in American minds is really associated kind of indelibly with 2 later American presidents, with Johnson and with Nixon. When Kennedy pulled us in, and actually when Eisenhower started the advising route, it was really colored by this whole idea of Cold War thought, the domino effect. That we had to be careful of more and more parts of the world becoming red. I grew up under this. I'm from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and Bethlehem is a big steel town. We produced all the steel for all the major wars through the Vietnam War. Having grown up in a town like that, we always believed that we were on the target list for the Soviet Union because of the steel plant. And it turns out there was no target list, but we thought that there was. But that's the context. This Cold War and real fear And the fear was real. I don't think we can discount that, and especially when you look at what's happening now in Ukraine. The government may have changed, but not the authoritarian style. So we're not talking about communism any longer in the Russian case, but it's still this huge military-industrial authoritarian complex. So, Kennedy, he commits us to advisors and he commits us to soldiers, and tens of thousands go. The problem is these American soldiers are going to support a very corrupt government in the South. Diem himself is assassinated the same year that Kennedy is assassinated, in 1963. He's assassinated because the government has completely lost the support of the local people, but it will take 10 full years for that to really play out and for the Americans to recognize the failure of supporting this very weak, very corrupt government. One sign of that corruption was from a very famous photo that was captured by an Associated Press photographer of a Buddhist monk who immolates himself in 1963, the same year that the President Diem is assassinated. He's setting himself on fire in protest to the incredibly strict controls that the Diem government was placing on all religious life. But Diem himself was a Catholic. When Kennedy dies, Johnson takes over, and despite his best efforts, he gets deeper and deeper into the war, and he sends more soldiers, more helicopters, and more planes. And these helicopters and planes, they're referenced very powerfully in the book, but from now the perspective of those fleeing the bombs in Hanoi or suffering from the gunfire strife along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that thin spine of the expanded letter S of Vietnam, the thinnest part that kind of ran down the spine of the country. These are some images of American soldiers. This leads to the fourth great loss in the book. When her many sons leave to fight in the war as patriotic Vietnamese, to fight against the South, but a little sidebar, the son who she lost during that land reform, the son who everyone thought was dead, it turns out to survive, he flees to the South, and he will end up fighting for the other side. That Ho Chi Minh Trail, so here are some images of the trail. Her sons will join the Viet Cong in the late 1960s. Her daughter will join the Ho Chi Minh Trail in 1972. This is what the trail looks like from the air. Much of it, again, ran in Laos. It was kind of a feat of engineering, and American war colleges across the United States call this one of the most brilliant engineering feats in human history to help a people win a war. And it's now actually, the Ho Chi Minh Trail is part of a big tourist industry in Vietnam today. These are some of the actual tunnels that the Viet Cong dug into. This is one of the Viet Cong soldiers, so imagine her sons and these soldiers, and imagine her daughter, the daughter who ultimately is raped, hiding in one of these tunnels. And here you see a women's brigade. So Dylan's daughter joins one of these women's brigades that existed by the thousand. All of them patriotic, not necessarily communist in ideology, but very much nationalists. So one of the sadder aspects of the war is what Americans dropped from the planes besides the bombs. We dropped napalm and we dropped Agent Orange by the millions of gallons. Agent Orange was a defoliation that was dropped. It's basically like Roundup times 100, and I think that is actually the figure that's quoted, Roundup times 100. And it's kind of an instant defoliation, and it rained down on American soldiers and Vietnamese alike. This is a map of where Agent Orange was dropped. And Agent Orange becomes sort of a forever chemical, and it ends up impacting the human gene and reproductive system. We'll come back to that in a bit, but that's also referenced in the novel. Here you can see sections of the Ho Chi Minh Trail that have been denuded. But look at the legacies of Agent Orange. They're also quite staggering. 20 million gallons with birth defects. If you recall, one of the great losses for the grandmother is she has a grandchild that's a stillbirth, deformed beyond imagination because of Agent Orange. So the war rages on, and in the late 1960s, things become more desperate in the South. We have more famous images. These images kind of burn onto the American consciousness. This is one of the South Vietnamese officials murdering a suspected Viet Cong agent / civilian caught on public. The Viet Cong are increasingly successful in Ho Chi Minh City with bombings. Nixon is beginning to speak out against Johnson's incompetence as a president, and Johnson is also becoming his own worst enemy in many ways. Eventually, Nixon becomes president, but he inherits a mess, and he only makes that mess worse, although he very, very quickly begins to draw down American troops. There are a couple major atrocities in the late 1960s that also capture the American attention, and they are burned into our image. Please remember this one, because I want to come back in a hopeful way by the very end of the presentation, just like 3 minutes. This girl in the middle whose clothes are literally burned off of her by a napalm bomb drop. These images begin to turn the tide of American public opinion against the war. This is the period of the next great set of losses. And look at how many kind of cluster all at once within this non-chronological novel. The novel really begins, the first pages begin in the early 1970s when the Americans are bombing Hanoi. And this is when their little modest house is destroyed. But it's also the same time period in this jumping back and forth throughout the 300 or so pages of the text that we learn that her daughter is raped, her son loses his legs along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a son-in-law, this is Hua's father, he never shows up, he's always referenced, he's always there in the background, he's the one who carved the wooden bird, the Tsung Ca. He never appears. He's one of the faceless victims probably bombed to smithereens along that trail. And then the stillborn grandchild. So all these losses that are occurring in the early 1970s are really representative of the lost songs that all of Vietnamese are experiencing in the same time period. But it's this collective loss and these images that are broadcast to the American people through our newspapers and through television, and we're becoming increasingly used to 24-hour news at this point in our culture. It becomes embedded in a future war, but the Vietnam War is the beginning of a constant news cycle for the Americans. The tide really begins to turn, and we get a very powerful anti-war movement in the US. This eventually leads to the peace accords in 1973. These peace accords that promise the American withdrawal, and it takes us 2 years to withdraw. We do that in 1975. And there's this very kind of famous imagery of the American evacuation. It's a little bit disorganized, and we left a lot of people behind in that evacuation from the US Embassy in Saigon as people are lifted off by helicopter, and then immediately after we leave, the North Vietnamese government forces come in tanks and seize control. The country is reunited, but she doesn't indicate much hope in the book during this period of being reunited. 1975, But reunited to what? It's reunited to labels and to fear. If you were a traitor, as the grandmother was, just to survive in the North, you were given really a bad class social label and you became a pariah. But if you happened to fight for the South and lost, you were also given a bad class label. And the suffering of Vietnamese from 1975 to about 1985, a 10-year window there, was also pretty intense because the policies were still quite extreme, and Vietnam was basically cut off from much of the rest of the world, isolated from the United States and the West for sure, but in 1979, China invaded Vietnam. So they went from one fire to the next fire. And this suffering is kind of dramatically displayed throughout the book. Lots of hunger again, lots of poverty, particularly crushing poverty in the countryside, and lots of boat people who flee Vietnam. So here's images, and you can see another 2 million will leave the country. So think about the entire 20th century as a century of senseless destruction, human loss, and then human drain. So Vietnam really suffered a huge brain drain of talent and energy and possibility. The book does end, despite all this sorrow, on some hopeful notes. And it's important not to lose sight of these hopeful notes. So in the last 2 minutes or so, I'll talk about these hopeful notes. The son who she lost during that land reform period in 1955, she thought was lost forever. But we actually discover in the late 1970s, early 1980s, that he's been living in crushing poverty and with terminal cancer in Saigon. And so she goes down with all the family to meet him. By that point, some of her older children had relocated to South Vietnam to work for this new united government. But because the brother had fought for the South, they couldn't really reconcile the differences. So it was a permanent division within the family. The son also had gotten cancer because of his exposure to Agent Orange. And he ends up dying of that cancer, but not without this renewal that took place between a mother and son that had been separated for nearly 30 years. The end of the novel also focuses upon a romance. The romance is between a granddaughter and, unknowingly, the grandson of the grandmother's biggest enemy. The enemy who was kind of directly responsible for the murder of her own mother during the Great Famine in 1945, who's referred to as Wicked Ghost within the novel. The novel kind of skips over several decades. It skips over the 1980s and 1990s and really the early 2000s, and it picks up the tale again around 2017. So I just want to come back to that little space of time that skipped over, because this is where the hope begins again for Vietnamese, and this is kind of the Vietnam that I first encountered when I went there. A policy of Doi Mai began in 1985, and that's when the Vietnamese government recognized that they can't keep doing things the way they've been doing. It's not working, the economy is in a shambles, and the need to open up. This is kind of a decision that the Chinese had made about 5 years before, when they moved away from focusing on politics only and started focusing on economic growth and development. So the Vietnamese did it about 5 or 6 years later than the Chinese did. And that has led to sort of the Vietnam of today, where we still have a one-party dictatorship, an authoritarian government, one where this book cannot be published in Vietnamese. But it's a pretty pragmatic government. It's authoritarian, to be sure, but it's in support of a hyper-capitalist economy. And the average standard of living for Vietnamese has increased dramatically. Ho Chi Minh is enshrined in Hanoi in a tomb, much like Mao Zedong is enshrined in a tomb, or Stalin was until he was pitched out, but Lenin is. This is the last image I want to show, and this is the image of hope. And I think it's a hope that we have to remember because it's how the author wants us to remember the story of the Vietnamese people. But it's also what I think we need to kind of hold on to as we imagine what's happening now in Ukraine. This is the same woman who ran through the village with her clothes burned off in the early 1970s in that famous iconic photo that I kind of shared just a few slides before. She now lives in Canada. You can see the scarring on her back, but you can also see the joy that she has holding her grandchild in her arms. And for me, this is very powerful because it's also a story of women of generations, women across time, of this incredible human suffering, but of resilience and hope. And I think that's the power of this book. Thanks very much. I think I talked too much. When I look at the time, I was supposed to give you guys 10 minutes.
No, that's fantastic. Does anyone have any comments or questions? We probably have time for 2 or 3. Yeah, let me bring the mic over.
What percent of the population today is under 45?
I looked at that yesterday, but I don't have any memory of it today. It's still a very young population, but I think what and so I can't tell you the figure, but what I can tell you will be the outcome. Between now and I think 2035, so for the next 15 years, Vietnam will produce a very sizable working age population that will carry them further than our working age population will. So their population is now just under the renewal number. You need 2.1 to sustain population growth. And if you go under that, then your population starts to decline, and that has long-term consequences for the labor force, the tax base, the support of the aging population. We kind of are able to hold steady only by inbound immigration. And lots of parts of the world are not holding steady at all. They're actually in crisis. Japan is evidence of that. Germany has been evidence of that. China is evidence of that. I'm very interested to sort of think about this from an historian's point of view. I also used to teach cultural geography at Nazareth, but there is a huge influx of Ukrainian refugees now into Germany. And what will that mean for the long haul? Will they go back, or will they become DPs, displaced persons who end up staying in Germany? But for Vietnam, it's not quite the young population that it was in the immediate aftermath of the American withdrawal and for the 1980s and 90s. It's an aging population, but it's aging fairly slowly, and they still have a lot of working years left.
Another question or comment, anyone? Linda, 1 second.
Thank you for your excellent program. I really appreciated it. We were in Vietnam a while back, and I think we were overwhelmed by the throngs of people in the streets. You couldn't even turn around. The bicycles, the people, the color, the smells, it was all overwhelming. And industriousness. And
was that in the South, in Ho Chi Minh City?
We were in the South. We did the whole country.
Okay.
We went up and down. And we were impressed by the beauty. We were depressed by the horrors of Agent Orange and the museum places we went to. we managed to actually, before they expanded the Chi Minh tunnels, we managed to crawl through the way they did then. I'll never be that thin again. It was absolutely an astounding trip. And what made the trip is that there were only 11 of us on the trip. And one of the women there was married to an NGO who didn't leave until the very end when he had to leave.
75.
And she was bringing their son back, who they sent back to America for safety in school, to see everything that he had missed. So between her and our guide, we had the most unusual tour of Vietnam ever.
Well, and I think, so that story you relate is, it's the power of this story, right? You have this immediate personal connection
Right.
to this place
Right.
that opens your eyes to it from the insider point of view, even though they were outsiders at the time. And that's the best you can hope for when you have those experiences.
It was awesome because of her and the guide and 11 people, the beauty of the country. And I happened to be teaching with a lot of Vietnam veterans, and I had
Right.
to take off from work to go, and they were cheering me on all the way. They had told me all these stories before. I think of all the places I've been in the world. We were in Cambodia. We went to the killing fields up.
It was
very
emotional, right?
It was a very emotional trip, and my husband's cousin was killed in Vietnam, and it was probably the most outstanding trip of my life. So I really thank you for this fabulous explanation.
My uncles fought in the Vietnam War. My father, who I mentioned to you, was raised in Pearl Harbor. And I'm named after my grandfather, who was the dredge master. He's the oldest of 11 kids. So many fought in the Vietnam War. And I kind of grew up on their stories, but it was a story of bitterness and disappointment and PTSD. And when I went to Vietnam, it was 1997, I was a little nervous. And literally 1 month before the American War Crimes Museum, which was the centerpiece museum of Vietnam, 1 month before they took the word American off the wall of the museum. So it was just War Crimes Museum. But the dirt behind the letters of American was still on the wall. And so I could read it, and then of course, where did it go? All of the placards inside were unchanged. And it was very sobering for me to see that. This friend I traveled with, who was kind of this French, Vietnamese, Cambodian, who I met in language school in Taiwan, we went together to the killing fields, and they have that map, the human skulls. And then the Tonle Sap is the river of blood that flows into the Mekong, which is also a river of blood. He looked at the map, and he started to cry, and he said, I'm one of these statistics up on the map, because it listed the number of killed Vietnamese in Cambodia, the number of killed Cambodians, the number of orphans that were created. And suddenly, I was there right with him. And so again, it's these stories. And as an historian, I have to tell those stories and try to personalize it and make it real for people. And that's the power of what you had in those tunnels and with your friend who came back.
Does anyone have one last comment? All right, thank you so much, Nevin. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.